Добрый день. Спасибо, что вы
Hello,
сегодня с нами.
thank you
Спасибо
for joining us
студентам
today.
сборника за то, что
Thank you
они
for
собрали
the
такую
authors of this
аудиторию
anthology for
обширную.
gathering so many
Спасибо
participants
аудитории за
of
то,
this
что вы
seminar.
здесь.
Thank you for all the participants for being
И,
here.
э, и э, э, я постараюсь сегодня говорить поменьше. Я думаю, что
I'll
мы
try to
действительно
take the mic
сначала поговорим о
less
том, как
often than
сделана
normally
книжка, да.
because
Я
I hope
просто
we will be
попрошу,
able to
сразу
focus
передам
first on how the
слово
book came into
составителям.
being, and I will
И
pass
буду
the mic
очень
on
рада,
immediately to
если
the editors of the
да,
anthology.
будет много
And I would be
вопросов и
really, really
реплик
happy if there would be many
от всех
comments,
присутствующих.
questions from you, from everyone present here on the call.
У нас сегодня два составителя, два из
We
трех
have among
составителей
us two
сборника,
out of
Клавдия
three of the
Смола и
editors of this
Илья
anthology,
Кукулин.
Claudia Smoller and
Добрый
Ilya
день.
Kukulin. Hello.
И мне кажется, еще...
Добрый день, здравствуйте.
Да, и мне
Hello.
кажется,
Good
еще
afternoon.
один, к
And I
сожалению, только
think
один автор,
there's
Илья
one of
Кукулин.
the authors also here, Ilya Kukul.
С Клавдией
Unfortunately,
мы
just
уже
one of the
несколько раз
authors.
говорили, у нас уже было сколько-то
Claudia is not the
записей, да, мы
first. It's not the
говорили
first. It's not the first time we have
про
Claudia as one
книжку,
of the
это вообще был
guests of
первый
this seminars.
семинар, который
Actually, the first
прошел,
seminar in this series
провел ЦТФЛ, да, про
that we had on this
Oxford
Tefel's
Handbook,
auspices
ту книгу,
about the
которая
Oxford
вышла вот
Handbook.
сейчас, но тогда еще уже обсуждалась в 22 году.
The book that we'll be focusing on
Значит,
today, we discussed it
советская
back then 3 years ago
культура андеграунда, да?
about the Soviet culture of
Культура
underground,
советского андеграунда.
culture of Soviet underground.
И 5 составителей которых, из них тоже сегодня есть двое,
And among
Клаудия
of
Смола
the
и Илья Кукуй.
two out of the five
И
editors of that
большое
volume are
обсуждение этой
also
книжки
here.
будет в ЦТФЛ через
And
месяц.
in a month's
И
time,
с
there will be a
Клаудией мы
large
обсуждали
presentation of
еще
this
тему, да,
anthology
это
at
была культура
ZFL.
еврейского андеграунда.
And also, we had
Да,
Claudia as
и
our guest
теперь
when we
мы
talked about the Jewish underground culture in the Soviet Union.
говорим об архивах.
So today we will focus on the archives.
Наверное, лучше, как мы сделаем, Клав? Сначала ты представишь
Claudia, what
книгу,
do you
да?
think? Shall
Да,
you
конечно,
first
я
introduce the
могу
book?
поделиться своей коротенькой презентацией и
Да.
I will
очень
first begin with my short presentation.
Сейчас я попробую. Так.
Let me try
Буду
sharing
спрашивать, видна ли заранее.
and just check with you whether you see the presentation.
Так. Вот, она у меня видна. Я не
Да.
знаю,
I
как
see
у
it. Do you
Да,
see it?
все видно. Спасибо.
Yes,
и
yes, we do.
листается ли.
Да.
And do you see me
На этой
swiping the
страничке.
pages? Yes, we do.
Отлично.
То есть я могу
Great.
начинать.
Да.
So I can begin, right?
Оля,
Yes, correct.
спасибо большое за приглашение.
Thank you, Olga, for inviting
Такой
me
замечательный и
to
важный,
this
как мне кажется,
wonderful and
информационный
very
семинар.
important, in my view, seminar today.
Ну вот, эта книга, которую мы вместе
This book
составили и
that we
написали
put together
Кукулиным
with
и
Ilya
Анной
Kukulin
Бахмайер.
and
Это
Annelie Bachmeier,
соотечественница и моя коллега
who is
в
my
Дрездене,
colleague
которая сегодня, к
from
сожалению,
Dresden,
не может
unfortunately
быть с нами.
today
Эта
cannot be
книга
with
была
us today.
задумана как
So this
первое
volume was
крупное
conceived as the
исследование
first major
нормативных
study
и
of
мемориальных
archival and memorial
практик
practices
советской неофициальной
in the
культуры.
Soviet unofficial culture.
Отчасти это издание результат
It
вот
is
той презентации,
partly
которую мы провели
the
в,
result
если я не ошибаюсь, в октябре
of the
21 года
presentation we
в
had,
университете
I believe, in October
Но,
21 in
видимо,
the
она не
University of Dresden.
ограничивается тем, что было
But
тогда,
it's not limited to what we presented
была
back there.
позже обогащена и
It
как-то
was enriched later on
расширена
and expanded,
благодаря еще каким-то авторам
thanks
и темам.
to the contribution of several
В
more
целом мы
authors and
попытались
several
сделать
more
такую
topics. We
концептуальную книгу
attempted
в том смысле,
to
что
make it a conceptual volume, and I mean by
все
this
статьи не
to say
просто
that the articles there
разбирали какие-то отдельные случаи мемориальных
are not
работ
focused
и
on
архива,
incidental practices
но
of archiving
объединяли
and
все это
memorial
в какой-то
practices,
степени
but that they
в некоторое общее
come
высказывание.
together in a sort of a joint statement.
В Сначала мы сходили из
joint
такого
narrative,
очень
if you will.
простого тезиса, что создание
We started from the simple assumption that the creation of anti-archives or counter-archives, depending on the
одной из
terms that
важнейших
one
форм
prefers, was one of the
культурного
most
сопротивления в
important forms
Советском
of cultural
Союзе.
resistance in the Soviet Union.
Неофициальным
Unofficial
историкам
artists and
пришлось в
poets
сущности заново
had
изобретать
to, in essence, to
возможности,
reinvent
формы, приемы
the
покорения
possibilities,
искусства
the forms, the
и
techniques
культуры,
of preserving
которые
art and
так
literature
не имели права
that
на существование.
were kind of not
Это
supposed to even
обобщение
exist. This is a
в России
generalization,
в
of
это
course,
время
but
было
as
влияние.
as one
Действительно,
of our
культура советского
talking
андерграунда
points, it's
стала одним из
acceptable.
самых
So
ярких
indeed, the
случаев
Soviet underground culture became one of the most
художественного
striking
архивирования
examples of
или
scientific and
самоархивирования,
artistic
которое,
archiving or self-archiving,
хотя и было
which, although
полуизолированным
was
от внешнего
semi-isolated
мира,
from the
не
outside
только от
world,
Запада, а, так сказать, в
not
глобальном
just from the
смысле,
West, but in
и я
global
сказать
sense
это
of the word,
полюбовно,
isolated.
естественно,
And
поскольку
I'm
это было
consciously using the word
очень
semi-isolated
сложным
because
явлением, и
in
все-таки
itself that was a complicated
история
phenomenon. Whatever
вполне
happened in this so-called
контролируемо, как бы
underground
общалась, вернее, было связано
was
с
related, interrelated, and
миром
communicated to
Советского Союза,
things
но
happening
все-таки
outside of the
все-таки
Soviet Union.
в
Though,
ограниченных
of
пределах.
course, in a very limited manner.
И благодаря этому отражало
And
интеллектуальные и
thanks
художественные
to that, it
тенденции
reflected the
трансформации
intellectual and
своего
artistic
времени.
trends
Ну, особенно если
characteristic
мы
of its
говорим о
time.
таком постмодернистском
So, if
архиве,
we're talking about a
где там
postmodernist
концептуализм
archive
и
or
так далее.
conceptualism
Это один
and
из
so on,
известных примеров того, как
this is one of
в
the
полуизоляции
notorious examples of how, in this, if in
underground
semi-isolation,
создавал
the
нечто,
Soviet
что займет
underground culture produced something that resonated
других
with
стран.
things happening in other
В том, что
countries.
книга посвящена наша авторам, дискурсам и формам художественного творчества, вытесненного из советской культуры
The book is
памяти,
devoted to authors' discourse and
это
forms of artistic
на
creativity
первый
that were
взгляд нового.
suppressed from the Soviet culture memory, and that is nothing
Необходимо,
new from
во-первых, была
the
проделана
first
значительная работа
at
по
first glance.
разбору, документированию,
Since the early 90s, significant work
описанию
has been
или
done to
советской или
collect,
неофициальной культуры.
document, describe, and study Soviet
Последние
unofficial
30 лет
culture.
появилось
Over the
множество
past 30
антологий.
years, numerous
Сегодня
anthologies have
третье
appeared, collections of samizdat and tamizdat
советского
texts, as
андеграунда
well
в
as
искусстве.
exhibitions of Soviet underground art.
Наш том — это насколько мы можем сейчас
Our
судить,
volume, as much as
создать
we
что-то
can
более или менее
say, and we can
обширное
tell,
на
it's the
эту
first attempt
тему
to create
на
something more or less
метауровне. То есть
comprehensive on
даже
this
то, что
topic on a
происходило и
meta level.
происходит сейчас, мы исследуем.
So even
Как
what
вот есть такое хорошее
happened
слово в
and
английском
is still happening,
aftermath, да, то есть
we
загробная
are
жизнь
studying from
андеграунда,
the
так
point of
сказать.
view of
Это
the
тоже
underground
выходит из такой же
afterlife,
задачи, как
if we were
отношение
to use
того,
the
что
English
происходит
term.
с
So
культурной
it's a
памятью андерграунда.
reflection of what is happening to the
И, конечно,
alternative
потом мы
memory.
задаемся вопросом, как советские маргинализированные
Um,
сообщества и
so in this book,
отдельные
we
люди
ask the question of
способствовали
how Soviet
формированию
marginalized communities and
альтернативной
individuals
памяти,
contributed
по
to
сути,
the formation of
социальной
alternative
памяти,
memory by
которые
creating archives
подразумевали
that
официальную культурную
undermined
память
official memory
СССР.
politics of of the
Это тоже
USSR.
непростой вопрос, потому что
And
андеграунд не
it's
был
not an easy question
монолитным.
because
Мы
underground culture was never a
его
monolith.
практики в какой-то
Its
степени
practices,
отражали то, что было
in a
наверху, в
sort of
какой-то
way,
степени
reflected
шли
what
и на
was
контур,
happening
то есть
above it.
были
So in some ways,
контркультуры, а
they
в
were
какой-то степени были
countercultural.
независимы
In
от
some
него.
ways, they were independent from the
Я
official
могу
culture.
коротко показать
And
структуру
so
книги,
let me
сразу
show you
ссылаясь на то, что она
briefly the book's
доступна
structure,
была. Ну, может быть,
even
я
though the
в
book
комментариях
was
и
available for
постараюсь
you to
выделить
see, but
первые
maybe this is
страницы
the first spread.
списка содержания.
You can
В
see the
первом
contents
разделе под
there. In the
заглавием
first
«Архивирование
chapter, under
субкультур»
the title of
две
Archiving
статьи лежат
Subcultures, there are two pieces by
«Исследование
Julian.
архива
First,
Азазела о
notes from the zone of
фальсификации
Kyiv and exploration of the
художника
Azazela
поэта
archive,
Азазела». И вторая статья Натальи
artist and poet
Талимуан
Azazela.
«Звуковые архивы
And the
советских
second piece is
окраин.
by Natalie
Записи
Moyne,
цыганских
Sound
сказок и
Archives from the
песен
Margins of
русских
the
в
Soviet,
Советском
recording
Союзе».
gypsy tales and songs in the
Здесь
late
из
Soviet
названия можно
Union.
понять, что речь
And
идет,
from the title of the article itself,
можно сказать,
you can
в отношении
understand that. And I
цыганского
forgot to say
портретного
that
архива,
in
не
relation to
будем
this
там лезть в корректность вообще этого термина «цыгане», речь идет
gypsy
о том, что
archive, and we
нужен
should
труд
talk
святого
about the
Еварда Алексея Геслера.
correctness of the term.
Автора знает,
It's a,
может быть,
we're
хорошо.
mentioning a collection by
В общем,
poet Efim Druza and bard
в
Alexei
этом
Gessler.
разделе речь идет
In
о
that part, we are
создании
talking
архивов, ну,
about
которые мы
creation of
можем назвать
archives
сегодня
of what
субкультурами
today we would call a
или
subculture
маргинализированными
or a
сообществами в
marginalized
СССР.
community in the
И здесь
USSR.
мне, наверное, просто стоит заметить, что нам важны были
And
не
here I
только
would note
какие-то
that we were
определенные
not
фигуры,
only
ну,
interested
какой-нибудь
in the
Эрль, Чертков
important prominent figures of Erl, of Cherkov,
Сергей Сергеев,
Sergei Sergei,
более коллективные, менее
but also
интеллектуальные
less prominent, more collective
явления,
phenomena.
такие как хиппи
For
и в данном
example,
случае
hippies or
цыгане. Второй раздел называется архивная эстетика и
or
поэтика.
the Gypsy Roma community.
Здесь у нас три статьи,
Second part is called Archival Aesthetics and Poetics, and we have three pieces there that focus on aesthetical and poetical um, um, practices of creating archives both in the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. Ilya Kuku examines the archival practices by Rynikunova and Sergei Sigey, as well as the samizdat magazine Transparence, which was focusing on modernism and underground and kind of established its own practices of archiving. It's very interesting. In one of the articles, you can read how those practices were countering the practices of memory by the magazine Часы. And so it was an internal it was a discussion about how a canon can be formed and how we can relate to the past. And so this diversity is also, and not a monolith picture presented, is also another topic tackled in those articles. We also have an article there by Mikhail Pavlovets, who explores the poetics of self-archiving by German Lukovnikov, and it's a jump into the present, even though German Lukovnikov started in those times, in those cultures, but he continued that tradition. And finally, we are looking at Mary Nicholas, how she investigating how Moscow conceptualism creatively subverted the laws of archiving. So these counter archives are very strongly related to Moscow conceptualism. We can say that conceptualism conceptualized the counter archive practices or intellectualized them. This third section, I'm sorry, I hope you see that the second spread, above there's Mary Nicholas, and now there's a third part here, artists as collectors, philologists, and cultural historians. My intuition tells me, and based on my research, I also believe that this is the least researched topic and area of how Soviet underground persons collected and historized their contemporary and culture and the culture of their past. So they became sort of scholars and academics, and but then of course the line between these two approaches was thin and not very clear, but we had a whole set of people in this niche or in this area who published books, who were scrupulously and very responsibly in a detailed way approached their publications, and who, and in a way, they were active as a counter institution, and they saw it as their ethical mission to look at the countercultural texts.
Здесь у нас есть статья Н. Комароми, сам издатский журнал «Часы» и контрархив неофициальной культуры.
Here we have the counter archive of the also informal philology is being studied here. He writes about philology of editions and shows how Vladimir Els and others, informal philologists, created an archive of modernist literature. And finally, the fourth chapter, last large chapter, Memory After the End of AG, so-called Afterlife, explores how underground archives have been interpreted and reinvented from the early 1990s to the present day. My article discusses the phenomenon of the preservation of intangible live performances in Soviet unofficial culture, how they are intended to preserve unofficial activity which cannot be materialized in artifacts. one of the most important topic for me is the notion of the life worlds of the underground. The culture of communication was even more important that the products they proposed. It was a part of their memorial practices. Maria Engström and Alexei Semenko write about the reappropriation of underground in contemporary pop culture. I think this is also under research sphere and shows how underground becomes a resource, apolitical resource, and enters the mass culture and shows how this memory is being implemented today. But not only today, in the 90s, there was also a big part of mass culture figures like Tsoi, Kuryokhin, and other. Also, Dorin Shellens examines art exhibitions of Moscow conceptualism from the 1970s. And finally, Mikhail Mroharsky's article shows a study of the 1994 exhibition Corridor of Two Banalities in Warsaw. This shows the cross-cultural links of two countries and their archival practices. Later, I will tell you that this edition is selective. It was not possible to include all of the topics due to technical and other reasons. The volume concludes with the special section entitled Artists' Testimonies, which features four texts: personal recollections and self-recollections by the Soviet underground, Sabina Hansgen, Andrei Khlobestin, Vadim Zakharov, and Pavel Arseniev. This is an artist and poet of our time that was interesting to compare in this section. You can go through these slides and I will tell several words about them in the slides. Counter archives is rather interesting for those who do archive studies. It is rather descriptive for us. It seems to me descriptive in terms of scientific parameters, but also we describe why counter archive. Is it a fashionable word, or this is something more that we can see? In the introduction, we mentioned concepts that have similar connotation in various academic contexts, such as migrant nomadic archives. Archives are more difficult to be collected when the culture is moving. The example here is Tamizdat, queer archives, artisan counter archives, or decolonial or post-colonial archives. We chose the term counter archive because underground, for me, and simply, Soviet underground was one of the most striking examples of counterculture in Eastern Europe. We could discuss because counterculture presents itself as a opposition to the main course and cultural mainstream, but at the same time, in my opinion, it was a counterculture because it undermined the uniformity and cohesion of the mass culture. And of course, we can say that all this existed in a narrow niche. I would say that underground created their own fields and dissidents believe it was like a part of the
Вообще тема
uh,
маргинализированной, исключенной,
mm,
складывающегося
Soviet
из
regime,
различных
which led
стран,
to such
конечно,
a
актуальна
situation.
сегодня
In
особенно.
general, the
Я говорю,
theme of
конечно, потому что
marginalized
для меня
groups
это
excluded from the emerging or established
очевидно,
canon of memory
это может быть не
has
так для
long
других,
been irrelevant,
но
and not only in Eastern Europe.
то, что происходит в Восточной Европе
What
с
happened
22
in
года,
Eastern
конечно,
Europe
особенно
since
тема
2022,
памяти,
especially
маргинализованной
the topic
памяти,
of marginalized
памяти,
memory,
которая не
memory which does not have a possibility and the right to be documented and materialized in archives. This notion became mm,
Восточной Европы, но, конечно, не только.
relevant
При том, что
now
архивный
for
поворот — это уже довольно старое
Eastern Europe and
явление в
beyond.
истории искусства особенно, которое
The
началось в
archival
80-х
turn in
годах.
art history
И вот
began
сейчас
in
я
the
перехожу к последнему
1980s.
Слайду.
And now I will go to my
Да,
last
речь идет о
slide.
том, о каких-то трендах,
It
охвате
is
архивных
about
тем, то,
trends
что
and
началось,
scope of
конечно же, не только с
topics,
22 года, а значительно
which
раньше.
started
Я бы сказала,
not
с
only in
99-го, если
2022, but
совсем новое
earlier
исследование этой
in
темы взять,
1999.
вот, тогда это уже попало в такой вот
At that time,
плодотворный
it
контекст на
was
самом деле,
already
когда
sunken
возникали
in
новые
a
музеологии и
fruitful
социальная
context
музеология,
of a
когда
new
достаточно стали
museology,
ну, как бы
official
пересматривать явление
museum
музеев,
studies,
и
when the
возникли такие
museums
явления, как
obtained
субъективация
the
архива,
new
где
meanings,
музеи, архивы становятся
the notion of
ну, как-то
subjectivity of archives.
триггерами социального знания
Museums
и
became
политики,
triggers of
и
the social
и так
knowledge
далее. Вообще
and
реальной
politics.
плюрализации истории,
It was
историографии. Но сам замысел,
about
несомненно, был связан
a
у меня
pluralization
с
of
трендами в
culture.
гуманитарных науках тоже,
For
и
me,
в
it was
конкретном
also a
случае в
link
дисиденте, я бы
to
сказала, двух-трех
humanities during
художников-исследователей
the
пытались создать архивы
last two or
группы
three
сообществ,
decades when
подвергавшихся
artists tried
переселению,
to
истреблению или
create new
обесцениванию.
communities subject to
Вот, наверное,
relocation and
наверное, я остановлюсь
depreciation.
на этом.
Maybe I
Это
will stop
как
here.
бы вот такие общие соображения, которые, наверное,
So these are my
думаю,
general
что
thoughts that
отчасти,
I would like, I
отчасти они
wanted
отражают то,
to
что было в блоге.
propose
Спасибо.
you. They are
Да, беру
subjective, but also they reflect the context, the content of the book.
Может быть, наоборот, не убирать, чтобы легче было задавать вопросы.
Could you please bring back the slide so it will be easier for us to ask questions?
Ну, секундочку. Ага.
Илья, как ты хочешь? У тебя какое-то тоже вводное слово, или я могу сразу
Ilian,
задать вопрос?
would you like to also
Даже два.
contribute us with several words? But also, if you have a questions which you're eager to ask, please go ahead,
Спасибо.
and then I will continue.
Ну, первый
Thank you.
мучающий меня вопрос, да,
First
значит,
question, which I am
контрархив,
very eager to
да,
ask.
тут как бы
Counter-archive.
сознательная такая игра с двумя значениями или нет, или какой-то из
Is
них
it
важнее другого? Контрархив в смысле антиархив,
counter-archive? It
антисоветские
is like
архивы, антиобычные архивы,
anti-archive,
антигосударственные архивы,
anti-Soviet archive,
или антиархив
anti-state archive, or does it mean
не архив?
that
То
it's
есть
not
сжечь
archive
не
at all?
сейчас, не собирать ее, или собирать ее не так, как принято. Ну, вот
Carpe
какое
diem,
значение вот
you
у
know,
этого понятия
live life
контр?
today.
То, что
What
есть
is
скобочки,
the
тут
meaning
понятно, да?
behind
Потому
this
что
word
тут как бы,
counter?
видимо, твой тезис, который, в общем, у тебя много где
What
звучит о
is
том,
the
что
idea you are trying to put
нельзя
forward?
отделить
That
андеграунд от
you
официальной советской
cannot
культуры, что это проникновение
separate
одного в
underground
другое,
from the
как
Soviet
бы, ну,
culture.
необходимо с ним иметь дело, а не
These are
смотреть оппозицию, да?
interlinked
А вот
linked cultures.
само вот это вот анти-контр без скобочек.
What did
Да.
you what meaning do you attribute to this word?
Или Илья, я не знаю,
I
как.
can answer, or
Я
maybe Ilya
предоставлю
would like to
возможность. Ну,
to contribute. But from me, I would like to confirm that both meanings are included. Ola, you show the complexity of this notion to the authors themselves, and we often forget this meaning. And I think that this is a very good point. This is a wide notion of culture. It is the Western culture. It is brought from the Western counterculture to the Soviet underground bases, and is at the same time is a certain concept, because counterculture for me is linked with diggers, with hippie culture in the West. But at the same time, it is productive if we analyze the Soviet underground as an antithesis to what has been there before. On the other side, it is interesting what you said. It was in a way anti-archive. It was something totally different than archive. Many considered archives something contradictory, and this academic character criticized by Kozinski. He himself works with a lot of materials, and his anthology was very inclusive. It was more inclusive than it was possible, and he was very particular with the documents. He paid attention what was going on with bureaucracy, hierarchy. It linked to the stories of the Chassis magazine. For those archive scientists and editors of the Chassis magazine, Ilya Kukuy may correct me. We should remember what Pasternak wrote. Do not launch archive. One should listen to the call of the future, not to look back. This is what's worthwhile to mention. I have also many questions. I visited your conference. I attended it. I came to talk about the Dissident Library, and that is why it is a great pleasure for me now to talk about this book. I see the agenda and I see the difference between who could take part, who could not, but also I see the difference how the chapters were organized, what authors wanted to stress. And that is why I have a question. I could you describe archipelago, how you select what you study, what you do not study. Because in the context of some is that it is very crucial, the idea of the to keep, to store, to have it.
So when there are texts with unclear authorship, sometimes you can identify the author, sometimes you can't. So where's the thin line between preservation and when you're talking about the archives, and on the other side, on the other hand, you don't have a clear policy, or but there could be an idea of preservation. So you don't do it with politics, but there could be you could have approached it, you could have looked at the practice. Was this a conscious decision, or just it happened that way, or can you explain and perhaps formulate the difference? Perhaps Ilya I've occupied the mic for a long time, says Claudia, but I'll be happy to chime in after Ilya shares his views. I don't want to talk too long. I do apologize. I have two comments. The first one is Alexander Koszykovsky has held his hand, he's raised his hand up for a long time. And secondly, Oleg, can you repeat the question? Yes. What I didn't do correctly is that we have quite a few participants who are new to our seminar. So my explanation: we first start with the format of more kind of interview with the authors of the book, and then everyone is invited to join. So I'm very happy that there are several questions. Alexander Koszykovsky is one of the brings in one of those questions, and we have a few more in the chat. So we'll slowly move towards that part. But to repeat my question, preservation of something, it's one of the primary practices of samizdat. You recite something in order to preserve it because you got something for one night and you send it off to someone the next day. So where's the distinction between the between preservation and archiving? It is really important here. So the answer to this question helps us to understand how our anthology that we made with Claudia, how it relates to the trends of archival science, let's call it. But so I will answer in a few steps. The first step, if we're talking just about samizdat, I could have countered the argument that samizdat's primary aim and practice was to spread and disseminate and not to preserve.
Такое противопоставление было сохранению и распространению. Предлагал чешский диссидент и
a Czech dissident and rock singer Jarosz was who in one of the interviews proposed this distinction between preservation and dissemination. If you are very protective over your magazine, then it's not a magazine. Magazine is something you can forget in a cafe. What is meant here is that there were possibly people for whom dissemination of samizdat was the way to read those texts, to bring those texts to the maximum amount of people in the shortest amount of time. So when this happens, the archiving and remembering we're talking about preserving the community. And here we stumble upon a very essential cultural problem. Starting with Peter Kosten, a German sociologist of culture, his work, theoreticians of the archiving and library science, that archives and libraries, and in some ways, and in a way, a library can be called an archive. It is needed to preserve the memory of the community and uphold the memory of the community. And something Claudia mentioned earlier, preserving the memory of the communities that shouldn't be there, they're not supposed to be there. It becomes essential. And here our anthology joins a set of recent anthologies, for example, Brahim Gouabli from Morocco. In 2023, he published in the US, he published Moroccan Other Archives. A little bit slower, and the interpreters need to be able to hear the names. Yes, so Moroccan author who in 2023 published a book under the title Moroccan Other Archives. I forgot that I am an enemy of interpreters because I normally present in English, so I do apologize to the interpreters. So the term other archives for me it's not a synonymous, but it's very closely related to the counter archives. It is an archive that undermines the historical narratives and that understanding of history that is being formed by state archives. And therefore, the unofficial, uncensored archives from an uncensored culture, they, of course, undermined the narratives of the established culture's self-understanding, and they still undermine that. These communities that are based on their shared understanding of the official culture, it continues now. Stanislav Lvovsky in 2012 wrote that while we used to think that the unofficial underground culture after the collapse of the Soviet Union would gradually join forces with in one cultural area and field with the official one, but it didn't happen, and we see now that there is a continuation of the traditions of the non-censored culture. There was a proposal to have a post-not censored culture, but it's a little bit too complicated for a term. And now I'm circling back to the idea that the archives of unofficial culture, let me interrupt myself. What we're calling the archiving of subcultures, now I realize it should have been called archiving of communities, because gypsies are not a subculture, or Sinti Roma, as we call them today in a proper term. It's not a subculture, it's a culture. But it's the archivization of that, archiving of that culture undermined the official narratives about what national politics were and about folklore was. And so that the archive and the story analyzed in this article was very essential, and it was something that was already clear in the Soviet times. So hippie is a subculture, but hippie is also a community. And archives of Azazela, that are also mentioned in another article in our volume, it's also about the memory of the community. And this is important. In the first reviews published in Israel, reviews on Konstantin Kuzminski's anthology of uncensored Russian poetry called Blue Lagoon, in those reviews, it was said that the practices of St. Petersburg underground culture, from which Konstantin Kuzminski emerged, it countered the very idea of archiving. So I'm circling back up to the beginning of your question, because it presupposed fixing the sparkles of inspiration. And inspiration, a moment of inspiration is a moment when a person creates something, writes a story or a poem or a fragment of a larger form. And this fragmented form is the way of living from day to day. And so the author is not primarily caring of establishing an archive, following the words of Pasternak mentioned earlier. And so the task that Kuzminsky put for himself was a paradox in itself, to create an archive of creative sparkle, which legitimized an unofficial community that was founded on these sparkles that countered the official narratives. With time, it became clear that it was not so much of a contradiction, but back then in the 80s, when Kuzminsky was creating his anthology, that was the perception. Did I answer your question, Olga? Thank you. I will not risk repeating the second of my two questions. I may just quickly add something to what Ilya said on publishing and archiving. These are two different things, especially in the underground. We should be separating those things and seeing them distinctly. But at the same time, in the underground, the boundary between those two different types of activities are very vague and blurry. There was a magazine called Archive, which in late 70s was published by Vadim Nechayev, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And there, if we differentiate, and we should differentiate the archiving practices of Soviet unofficial countries, the impetus there was the, that we should document everything happening now in the unofficial culture in order for it to not perish, in order to preserve it, in order for the times when the new times come, it can become a canon, or not a canon perhaps, but takes its place in the history of art. Well, it would not become a canon, but it would be fixed and would uphold the existence of communities, and all of those different communities that were not under control of popular culture. In their own pace, they arrived at the realization that they should fixate and preserve their culture. For example, Boris Grebeshnikov remembered that in the 70s, not many rock groups thought of recording rock bands, thought of recording their underground albums, even though some of them had the recorders available, because the most important passion for them was to play here and now. And only with time passing, they realized they could actually record what they were performing. Yeah, and it's important that the such mechanisms as archive, but also the clock, out of precisely those considerations, they tried finding literary critics, that it becomes a form of self-reflection, because without self-reflection there is no historization, or that you can't make history of culture out of this. So the reviews by critics, literary critics or art critics, those elements are still not researched enough in relation to Soviet underground culture, but those were memorial practices in relation and in thinking, in considering the future. Thank you very much. The questions, they arrived in this order, I believe. Mila Fedorova, then Alexander Koshakovsky, then Alexander Dmitriev. Mila, please, the floor is yours. Do you want to take the mic, or should I read your question? I can read myself. In some way, it has already been answered. That for me, in this research, conceptually important is the mix of temporality. I asked this question a little bit too early in the conversation. So my question was how much looking at the past looking from on the present from the future, and this approach to the future memory was in the text, and how much of it is the position of the researchers of today that are researching the counter archives from the past. I can respond, says Ilya, if Claudia also would like to add on top of that. Okay, but you say, and then I will add up. Well, Mila, happy to see you. Hello. This is a very deep and big question, and it's foundational.
I think that many expressions today reflect what was in the scope of interest of those people who wrote books, created archives. What is happening is we can call interference of our understanding, our knowledge about archives and practices, our optics. We perceive these optics, and that is why we use the word counterculture, counter-archive. At the same time, we can keep balance between theoretizing and balancing, as the participants and artists perceived their activity. This is, of course, the very general answer. Maybe Ilya would contribute. Thank you very much, Clara. I'm also very glad to see you. For me, your question has two parts. German theories of culture, German Lube, said that some communities especially prepare for themselves something which in the future would be perceived as the memory of these communities. The example is capsules of memory, which could be dug out 1,000 years later, or the messages people are sending in spaceships to other civilization, possible civilization in the galaxy. So there are communities which want to be remembered in a certain way. In this sense, there is a duality in the way we see it. There is a community which wants to be remembered in a certain way, and there is a view of researchers which study how the community wants to be remembered and picks up the documents, facts, artifacts, and things which communities does not want to show and does not want to be remembered about it. And there is a difference in these two views, and this view depends on who is researching. On the one hand, we have researchers which focus on how the community wants to be remembered. We see manifestos or canons, what are our main features, our main poems, are they following, etc., etc. On the other hand, there are papers and works and texts which deconstruct the culture, like the text by Avramenko, which pays attention at differences of texts in different communities. We see, for example, a text about inequality between men and women in Soviet society, or in unofficial communities. The second level is the following. Starting from the 1970s, the scientists talk about archive turn in culture. So there are cultures which follow archive practices, like creating mocking museums, like the Belgian example, and they become a way to understand how people memorize and translate symbols in history. For example, the museum by Orlov Brothers in the Soviet Union, following the Western influence and partially by own driving forces of Soviet uncensored culture, there was an archival turn too, and we see it in the works of conceptualists. They laughed, mocking their own. They loved mocking archival practices and create their own. There is a metaphor alongside or a counter side, following what the conceptualists had, and on the other side, to understand what was the vulnerabilities in their position and to make the deconstruction. Mila, I think this question of temporality is very important. We did not manage to include in the book how artists and poets themselves memorized their own time. how they assessed their own activities.
Это очень интересное
And it is not
интеркорпоративное
only
понятие.
documents,
Нам
but also
значительно
self
удалось говорить не говоря об этом,
perceiving.
поскольку, в общем-то,
I
это
think
первый
it would
том
be
более
very good
500 страниц.
if
толстый
we could
получился.
include, although
Да,
there was
всего
no
этого. Но
space. It's
Илья
quite
упомянул гендерный
thick
момент, он
already, over
невероятно важен,
500
поскольку
pages.
на самом деле, если уж
But also, Ilya
грамматику
mentioned
учебную,
the
то
gender
в практике концепции
perspective. It
памяти
was
мы
also very
очень ориентированы
important
именно на
in the
мужской
context of
состав области
memory.
памяти, так называемой. Потому что на самом
It was
деле
very
мужчины
much
были частью ее
male-oriented.
исполнительной части.
Women
Работая с техникой, они их
often
перепечатывали,
were
они делали копии. А
technical
вот такими творческими, научными архивистами
rather
оказались, как правило,
technical stuff.
мужчины. Они создавали концепции
Uh,
архива, они
those
выбирали
who created
кого
were
туда
men.
войти, кого надо взять в
Men
будущее. Вот
selected whom
примерно так.
to
Не
take
всегда,
to the
но в
future,
целом это
whom
так.
to write
Ну и были
about,
субъектами,
etc., etc.
как бы это
Of
сказать,
course, there were
я
also
не хочу сказать
subjects.
колонизации.
I do not want to
Думаю,
use
здесь у меня тоже
the
очень
word
много
colonization. It may
возражений,
lead
но
to
вполне себе
many
попытка
objections,
подбора
but still,
и
it
концентрации
was
на
a
одном
kind of
или месте. Это
a
так.
certain selection to the canon.
Спасибо.
Who
У
would
нас
become a part
еще
of the canon?
у нас в
Thank you very
чате все
much.
время возникают
We also
вопросы.
have
Пожалуйста, Александр
questions
Кочаковский.
in chat. And now, Alexander
Спасибо вам
Kuchakovsky,
большое. Я
the
думаю,
floor
что
is
количество
yours.
вопросов, оно
Thank you very
действительно
much.
максимально
The number of
красноречиво для того,
questions
чтобы понять, что книга очень попала в нерв.
perfectly
И мне кажется,
show
прежде
how
всего упоминание и
relevant
советского
the book
контекста,
is.
и контекста
Mentioning the
сопротивления, и
Soviet
слово «архив»,
Soviet
наконец, который сам
context,
очень насыщенный
archive,
и сам по себе в
this
эмпирическом
word
восприятии,
in
в многочисленных теориях, которые часто
empirical
ощущается, что
meaning
они даже
is
давят,
very
не позволяя развить вот
important,
что-то, что выходит из этого термина на более
which
эмпирическом и
dominates.
историческом уровне. Я, наверное, попробую тоже сформулировать вот какую-то
I
свою
would like
мысль,
to formulate my
указав на то, что, мне кажется, еще не звучало, и что, наверное, у меня вот было
ideas.
первым впечатлением о
What was
книге.
not mentioned,
Действительно,
it
архив,
was my
мне
first
кажется, нас это
impression.
слово привлекает, потому что
The
архив
word
больше человека.
archive
Он
is
дольше живет, он
attractive to
предназначен для
us.
того, чтобы
It is
пережить
larger than
время
a
человеческой
person.
жизни. И главное, он
Archive
больше автор, еще
can
больше
outlive
высказыватель.
a
Архив дает
person,
повод для жизни, повод для
and it
действий. Он не сводится к
gives the
законченной концепции.
possibility for
И здесь,
further
мне кажется, что
activities
важно, мы
and
много
further
упоминали архив
thoughts.
и
And I think this
материальность,
is
упоминали архивные
important.
практики,
We
но при этом
spoke
на уровне
about archival
материальности и для
practices,
советского
but on the
контекста,
level
формального
of
контекста, мне кажется важно еще такое понятие
on the
ввести, как
material side,
архивный
I
дискурс.
think it is
Потому что
important to
когда мы опираемся на
introduce
архивные
the
практики,
notion of
на концептуализм,
archival
на собирание
discourse
архива
when we base
самоздата,
on
у нас как бы в таком
conceptualism, on
бесконечном
samizdat
анахронизме, который
collection.
предполагает понятие
It is
архив,
anachronic
возникает
for
некая
us
нулевая точка. Точка начала
as
собирательства.
far as the
У нас как
archives
бы
are
есть некий
concerned.
такой советский
We
апокалипсис,
choose
все
a
закончилось, и
point,
мы должны теперь
a kind of
собрать,
a
да,
Soviet
открыть как бы новую точку исхода. И мне кажется, как раз эта
a
точка, она
starting
очень
point.
парадоксальная и в некотором
So
смысле
we choose
сужает
this
наш
point
горизонт,
and
потому
start.
что, например, вот вещь, которая, например,
But
интересует
at
меня
the
в моей
same time,
работе,
it
она тоже, мне
narrows
кажется,
our
исходит из
view.
дискурса архива,
In my
но идет противоположной
work,
стороны. Во многих
it
мемуарах, вот, например,
is
у Голенштока или у Гарфункеля,
true, like
возникает
in
архив
Garfunkel,
или
in
музей
Golenstock,
как уже существующий,
archive
но
and
как только, да,
museum
люди
are
как бы
shown as
вытесненные из
something
формальной области
existing
вынуждены уходили,
already,
чтобы
but
находиться
also
внутри
as
архива, уже
points
созданного до них.
where
И
people
мне
could
кажется, вот это тоже очень
find
важная
a
часть, чтобы
shelter.
понимать
People who
в целом
cannot find their
вот эту
place in
ситуацию, как бы архивную
activities.
ситуацию
So
архивного
it is
сопротивления
important to
для
mention, to
понимания. Потому что, мне
understand
кажется,
fully
когда
the
мы
meaning
говорим о
of
мемопрактиках, в этом
archives.
есть некий такой прагматизирующий,
Uh,
да, аспект. То есть понятно, что,
there
безусловно,
is
мы можем говорить о диссидентстве
um,
как о
mm,
практиках комьюнити,
something
собирания
pragmatic.
комьюнити, сообщества,
It is
сопротивления,
also
поддержания
part of
идентичности. Но
collecting
вот для меня здесь
communities,
сокрыто некое такое
um,
коварство методологическое, потому что если
preserving
это вот таким образом
identities. But
упростить
for me,
существующие вот
it
этого
is
академического парадигмы, да, мы
contradictory in
изучаем
a way.
практики как бы
We are
собирания с
studying
людьми, самих себя. Мне кажется, мы
this
уйдем из
aspect
как
of
бы
people
не менее
studying
важного
themselves.
и, собственно, и
But if we
обусловливающего вообще
concentrate
как бы
on
идею
it,
исследования, понимание того, что архив есть на
we
уровне
will
дискурса, и
distance
особенно в советском контексте он есть на уровне
ourselves
дискурса,
from
уходя при этом очень далеко. То
archive
есть, как
as
минимум,
a
как бы
discourse.
период, начиная там с
Or at least if we are
репрессированных
talking
20-х годов, когда, собственно,
about
поколения людей
repressions in the
живут как бы в интимном
20s,
состоянии, архив
when
для них
people
становится
are
такой как бы
living
субкультурой, территорией,
outside of the active
где они
life.
пребывают.
and archives are becoming their refuge. And as the external part of archives, as archive is outliving a person, archive can be divided into two parts. It's long, it's huge, it can outlive also a regime on the one hand, and on the other hand, archive is something you can collect and take away in a suitcase. When we spoke about conceptualism, it shed light to the idea of the book that archive is linked to the emigration wave in 1980s when informal culture left the country, and what the canon is formed, how we see ourselves. My question is, did you understand this book in the view of the canon, also the same way I described, or you focused on the discourse of the archive, which could merge with a counter-Soviet mentality of the people who wanted to outlive the regime and find refuge in archive, be part of archives, be archive servants, so to say. And thank you very much again for this discussion and for the book.
Я могу ответить на этот вопрос. Клава, а ты как?
I can answer this question, Klava. Would you join? Yeah, this is a very large and important question. Alexander, first of all, I'm glad to see you. It's been years we did not meet. For me, your question divides into two parts. First, what you called a censored and uncontrolled reality, what people took away in a suitcase when going to immigration. This is a question of perception in the context of our previous conversation. What people wanted to preserve and take away to pass to other archives, to Israeli archives or other countries. And the other question was the Soviet archive discourse. And here we have a problem. Stalin, in his address in the magazine Proletarian Revolution, he said that the links to the archives for historians is not necessary. According to Stalin's doctrine, who said what when does not matter. Stalin knew what he said because Trotsky also edited the book at the same time, how Stalin forged in history. And starting from that point, that was the letter, when a magical world, a rotten liberalism appeared. It was not like the first time, but it was very explicit at that time. And starting from that point, and actually even earlier from the 20s, those people, the Axis, as they call those who noble people who lost their social status, they were very much interested in archives, in which preserved their memories about their pre-revolutionary life.
On the other hand, those who were socialized under the Soviet times realized that museums and archives are places where everything is preserved. From their point of view, something documentational fixation of what was happening back then. So, and in a way, archiving mentality was in opposition towards the Soviet official narratives. And here we stumble upon a big problem that the theoreticians of archiving stumble upon very recently in the countries which can be kind of called Western countries. The archives are normally perceived as a personless, impersonal bureaucracy, according to Max Weber. It's a memory of the state which is impersonal and contributes to a huge community by Benedict Anders. But with time passing, it became clear that you don't have to look at this idea from the Weber's point of view, that the personal perspective of those who worked with the archive was important for the archiving, for the preservation. Armenian archivist published an article by Sonia Prosper, who was a PhD student, and that article and that work got the prize for the best archiving PhD work. They analyzed, they made a survey of a huge number of archivers, especially young archivists in the US. It's called the work was conceptualizing archives community describing themselves, and they're speaking about the archives of minority groups, so for example African Americans, so special archives of African Americans. But I think in general it's a very important question also in relation to Soviet history. So those who worked in the archive, they had a very personal attitude which had ethically good and bad consequences, because there were some archivers who considered themselves the owners of the archives for which they worked. And on the other hand, there were those in the 60s and onwards in the Soviet humanities. There was it became fashionable, and it had deep meaning for archive publications that were also the proof that history was there, history was happening, that modernism was there, that you couldn't push it out, that the innovations in culture were there. And someone was like the authors perished in Gulag, but their correspondence lived, their works lived on. And so these archive publications became a sort of late Soviet cultural institution in themselves. So the archival discourse, which you mentioned, a development of that discourse was a crucial element of the culture. And this is a topic for yet another anthology. Yes, and I will join you in this last statement, Ilya. Alexander, thank you very much. This is part of what we were considering, but also continuation. I think we should be talking about immigration in a multidimensional way, because in immigration, many of archivists stopped their archiving, and their internal passion and pressure and impetus, this pressure, this impulse to overcome the pressure of the official culture, then it caused them to be productive and efficient and in collecting and this reflection of the archives over the prohibited banned culture, and this identity of being unofficial countercultural or underground actors in form of philologists or poets or writers, it could completely lose its foundations for that identity in the new culture, and going to a new culture and starting archiving new culture and creating new history. It did happen in some cases, but it was rather rare, and it's not always easy to empirically prove this. The existence of this fact. So going back to your question, but superficially maybe answering your question, I would say that it's really interesting to reflect on what history of Russian culture was created by those who left the country, because quite often that was a very conservative culture. For us, underground is a continuation of avant-garde, but in reality, quite a few of them actually joined the previous, the tradition of the past. They never discarded anyone. they were in Transponence magazine. Yes, that could be. But in general, the orientation on modernism, Wagin, whom we already mentioned, if we look at his publication, how many people were involved, and how they worked it, or Khodasevich publication, you see, looking at those publications, that the continuation of what happened. You see the continuation of what was happening before the revolution. So I think we should remember this when we discuss and kind of reflect on what kind of version of culture was worked on in the Tamizdat, whom they put into the canon.
Спасибо большое.
Thank
Вот
you.
у нас есть
Thank you so much.
вопросы,
We
несколько
do have
вопросов от Александра
questions,
Дмитриева. Наверное,
several questions
Саш,
from Alexander
давай теперь
Dmitriev.
тебе слово,
Alexander,
и
let's
потом,
hand over the mic to you,
пожалуйста, Алексей
and
Браточкин.
then the next would be Alexei Vratochkin. Yes, thank you so much. I'll try to be brief.
Тебя плохо слышно.
У меня скорее вопрос про... Да, совсем? Ага. Без наушников.
Да, отлично.
Про
I'll try
зону
without the headphones.
лучше? Или не слышно?
Очень хорошо слышно, да.
Сейчас. Да, вот сейчас, кажется, должно быть слышно, да?
Probably you'll hear me best now.
Это про зону полуофициального, да, то есть про...
So my question is about the area of semi-official, the short literary encyclopedia.
Чтобы, условно говоря, не
So
злоупотреблять понятием
the issue of
контр, да, или резистанса.
not overusing or abusing the notion of counter archive or resistance. It's an essential term, and it meant different things in the 60s and the 80s. But so my question is about the gray areas of possible things and sanctioned things. Of course, it kept shifting, but they were there, right? So thank you for considering my question.
Да, это огромная тема.
Yes, this is a huge topic.
Этим. Я знаю, что это
I was not venturing into that area, but I know that this was a very big part of our. We wanted it to be a very big area, a big part of our volume, but it didn't work out because the notion of Soviet underground is it already means that it's not a fully underground, but it's intermediate areas between the official and unofficial. There were people who worked in both areas and published who published their drawings or paintings or text in both zones. And so this area of semi-censored things, I'm mostly interested to look at this if when talking about humanities in the Soviet times, because the historiography could somewhere in the margins could be published, historiographic works could be published in the margins, and at the same time be not be centered on Soviet understanding of history. Like this in our volume, and this is worthy not just of a section of the book, but maybe of a separate volume. May I continue, Claudia? Yes. I'm not interrupting you? No, you're not. So, Alexander, riding the wave of Claudia, I would say that the answer to your question is somewhere in between. I started talking to Alexander Kochakovsky about those who have found maybe not a refuge in archives, but it was a form of resistance towards the Soviet politics of maybe not complete lack of memory, but very artificial memory or very, very specific kind of memory. And you are right. This resistance was not always conscious. It was often based on the preferences of those people, preferences in terms of what was the most productive in terms of preservation. It was their choice of of more ethically correct future me perception compared to other options they considered. So these gray areas had also different grades of shades of gray. There were different ways of being censored or banned, and we spoke about that in the foreword for the book because, of course, there was work in the museums, which in itself had the semi-dissident nature because people were trying to preserve and rescue what Soviet framework wasn't keen on preserving. There was, of course, the opposite pole, the historic publications. There were, of course, the PAMIs, the memory publications, which were talking about things that were tabooed in the Soviet times. But from the point of view of secret services, KGB, and censorship, but also there was a Tsvetaeva's seminar of Lev Mulkin, which was not banned technically, but those who gathered there and discussed Tsvetaeva or other immigration authors, they realized that they're doing something that is not fully endorsed or condoned by the Soviet authorities. So the spectrum, the palette of these gray areas deserves research in the future. Indeed, I would say that this is also a zone of no visibility. If we look at the spatial metaphors, it's something in between. It's beyond being something that cannot be found. When I write about Jewish underground, I give a lot of examples of when, for example, Andriy Volokonsky spent time in archives and the storages of the Lenin's library, and he was able to find the books that were prohibited. For example, the Jewish Kabbalah. He studied it in the archives of, and he took it incorporated into his prohibited theories. So the sourcing of knowledge was dispersed and the sources of information were diverse and scattered around. So I believe that we can talk about this interspace in between and or spaces around something, and that these fields were related. I think this was more of a network structure that is not well analyzed and researched. There should be a book about this. But invisibility in one way was visibility in another way. Something that was falling out from the Soviet mainstream can actually become visible or something that can be found from the point of view of international Slavic studies. And the question is by whom they wanted to be found. And that's the next question on the path and the journey that Claudia just outlined. Now Alexei Vratochkin is the next to take the microphone. Hello. My question somehow intersects with the question by Alexander Dmitriev. From the Belarus perspective, I'm looking, and I'm in Germany right now, and I remember about Belarus. And in the headlines, there are barely any reference to national perspectives or lenses. And Soviet is kind of identical to Russian. And so my question is why is this happening? So we mentioned Yurchek's book was also criticized for focusing on specific cities' experience. So how is this relevant for wider audience? And this is my question. And I just wanted to reiterate that this is an immensely important book, and I like its idea and what's happening in Belarus since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I see that the iteration of the cycles of protest are also related to the disappearance of archives and materials in the digital age, and the attempts to archive and historize things. So the book is very helpful, but this is my question.
I allow myself to answer the question first. I agree with you, Alexei. We had a situation and we organized a conference and announced the call for papers. And it was written there explicitly about diversifying archival practices geographically, culturally. It turned out that we received about Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Central Asia, and that was an accident. We received positivist proposals, answers about archives in different areas. We wanted to make a conceptual volume. We needed to select. Now, I think it would be very difficult to publish the edited volume the way we did, because recently we are witnessing a shift which does not allow us to publish books we would publish several years ago. The same situation happened with Oxford edition, which we finished before 2022. After 2022, we had to stop the work and continued, including chapters from different geographic regions. And this book was published 2-3 years later. And the book we are discussing now, we're presenting now, shows a more homogenic perspective in terms of culture. But in terms of self-critics, we shift more towards conceptualism. This as a movement more known in the West, which shows more explicitly post-memory. And I think we managed to show it. I think it would be more relevant now to write and publish books which discuss with what we are doing. And of course, I repeat, that was the first attempt, and we need to consider it as a product of its time. This is what I think.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
У нас есть еще сколько-то вопросов в чате.
We have a number of
Время у нас
questions,
катастрофически заканчивается, то есть мы можем
but not much time
продолжать
left.
говорить в той мере, в которой, значит, есть вопросы, да, но
We can
переводчиков мы
continue
отпустим.
our discussion, but let
Поэтому
our interpreters go when the time is up.
Ирина Веселова.
And now, Irina Veselova, your question.
У меня скорее не вопрос, а
Hello, good
комментарий был, который я
afternoon.
уже
I
высказала,
have
чтобы
rather
не задерживать слишком сильно. И спасибо
comments,
большое за
not
книгу.
the
Я, к сожалению,
question.
не со всеми частями
Thank you
успела
very much for
ознакомиться,
the book.
но,
Unfortunately, I
может
did
быть,
not have
где-то
time
в
to read
каких-то
all.
разделах это и фигурировало, но вот я просто
Maybe
отметила,
some
что
chapters
в этом
contain
случае,
what I'm
наверное,
going to
интересно еще
tell.
и учитывать
In this
развитие технологий, про то, что написано, да,
context, we
то время
also should
каких-то
consider
новых
technology,
печатных там копировальных аппаратов, средств звукозаписи,
appearance
вот
of
позднесоветское время, да, и уже если мы
new
двигаемся ближе к настоящему,
methods
то
of
интернет и
printing,
компьютеры, и новые
internet
средства сохранения архивов,
computers,
да, такие
recording, and
технологии.
other ways or
Вот. А второе,
technologies
с этим
of
связанная идея,
preservation of
которая
archives.
мне
This is
пришла в
the
голову, ну
first
вот
thing. And the second
я
idea, which I would like to
сейчас
mention,
немножко немножко перестроечная рок-музыка, а точнее даже не рок-музыка,
is connected to the topic I am studying. It's Soviet rock musicians,
людей, обладающих
music.
соответствующим оборудованием, которые могли бы
It was
помочь
mentioned
создать
already
записи.
here
Даже
that
это были люди,
people
которые
who
там были
possessed
далеки иногда совсем
recording
от какого-то андеграунда,
technologies
но при
were
этом они
very
принимали
highly
участие в создании
demanded.
таких архивов. Вот.
They took part in
Да, спасибо.
creating archives,
Может быть, будут какие-то комментарии по
and
этому поводу.
their contribution was very meaningful. Maybe you can
Да, у нас
comment
тоже, к
on
сожалению,
this.
одна статья выпала о
We
оцифровывании
had an
в
article
настоящее
which
время,
we could
начиная
not
по
include
особенно
in
вот в
this
некоторых
publication
исследованиях,
about recording archives.
рост вот этого дигитального архивирования начался где-то в
The
50-е годы, я
growth of
показала
digital
очень
archiving
немало до этого, но все-таки. И это на самом деле изменяет наш
was
характер нашей памяти
more evident
о
in the
советской неофициальной культуре. Она
1990s. It
становится более
brings new
доступной, ее
perspectives and
материальность
it makes
становится
the
более
archives and
ощутимой.
the
То
memory
есть вот этот
more
вот
accessible, and its
сам издатский издатель стал
material
более доступный
essence
как артефакт
is more
времени.
tangible
Вот, я немножко пишу об этом в
and
своей
more
статье.
available as
Конечно же,
artifacts.
это
And I write
говорит о
about
том,
this in my article.
тоже о своего рода
It confirms
квантитативном подходе к этой ушедшей культуре на
us
самом деле.
in a
Вот
way a
Моретти,
quantitative
да, вот эта идея
approach
Моретти
to
для
this
далекого чтения, я не
culture.
знаю, как она на
The
русском,
theory
на
of
русский переводится.
Moretti. I do not
Теория
know
книга Моретти вышла по-русски на службе
how
дальнего чтения
it
в
was
переводе
translated
Александра
into
Санфорда
Russian.
с
Uh, uh,
переводчиками.
the translator was Vdovin.
Дальнее чтение, оно сейчас становится
It's
более, и
for
его
the reading,
различия
like in Russian, дальнее
соотношение с
чтение. And
оцифрованной
this term is
продукцией,
being
которая на самом деле
used
была разрознена раньше, а теперь она, по крайней мере,
when
в
talking about
изучении
recorded archives. There is a
такой
certain challenge
всеобъемлющей и растущей
related
постоянно
to
коллекции
this. It's
дигитальных
a
пространств.
comprehensive
Вот. И
and
начиная с
growing
тысячи с точки
collection
зрения Моретти, нам, к
in
сожалению, не
the
удалось получить
digital
одну статью,
form.
связанную
So we
о
had the
компьютерном
article,
лингвистике.
the chapter
Читают сейчас с точки зрения вот этого
about this,
квантитативного подхода.
about
Вот. Но это то,
this
что мне пришло
quantitative
сейчас в
approach.
ответ на ваш вопрос.
This
Одна
is
из
what I
немногих
thought
publikaционных
when I
материалов о том,
heard your
что
question. So
получилось.
I'm very sorry we did not
Я
include this
сожалею о
article.
том,
We
что
could
мне не
not do it.
получилось как бы раскрыть все, что есть в
I
вашем
am
сборнике, да.
very sorry that I
Значит,
could not
вопрос от
shed
Александра,
light on
от Александра Даниила.
everything which is included in your publication. Now, a question from Alexander Daniel.
Я, собственно, в чате написал, но если найдешь у
I
кого
wrote
вопросы,
my question in the chat, but I can repeat it.
Видел, буду расслышать ваш голос.
It's been a long time I did not see, so I will be happy to hear the question from you personally.
Вас, кажется, подвел не так давно.
Слушайте, Азохан вы.
I think I let you down recently. It's okay.
Это
Don't
отдельный
mention.
сюжет.
This is a different story.
Значит, о серых зонах, о которых
About the
вы
gray
заговорили
zones
сегодня.
you
Мне
mentioned today.
показалось, что прежде чем изучать специфику серых зон, вот тех, что между
I
чистой
think that
нелегальностью
before we
и
get
легальностью,
to studying gray
следовало бы
zones, what is legal, what is illegal,
провести
we ought
положено. Потому что эти зоны устроены кластерно. Это
we
журнал,
ought to define the
это
zones.
альманахи,
There are
сборники,
clusters,
опять же, в той или иной
TV,
степени. Я имею в виду
published
альманахи или
documents,
сборники, которые
almanacs and collections
были напечатаны.
under glove leaf
Это научные кружки,
stamp.
школы.
These are scientific circles and schools.
Просто с перечисления.
We should just list. Does Prometei is Prometei in the list or not? Of course, it depends on the researcher's decision, but in my opinion, it should be there. I think we should set the formal criteria and list them. I think that it is necessary to to consider formal and content criteria. There were parts which people in 1970s people would understand what is worth following. For example, Library Evrika. There was an official library with large print run, but suddenly Chudakova is being published within the series, and this led to a significant echo and impact. I saw recently Sasha Skochilenko's illustration, A Political Prisoner Exchanged in August 2024. She published a book by Aldous Huxley with her illustration, and I saw that she picks up the great tradition of earlier illustrators. And I think it is not only inventory that we should do, but also understand why the content content matters. In my chapter, mentioned in the very beginnings, Oxford Handbook of Underground Culture, I wrote it. Also in the introduction about a club, which was recently published in the magazine Slavic Literatures. And I agree with you, this should be continued. A sociology of unofficial communities, official too, not only those who were in the underground. This is a new field of study. And from the point of view of our archive science, it has a lot of perspectives in the framework of your approach. It is very promising field of science.
У Евгении вопрос есть.
Что-что?
У Евгении есть вопрос, Евгения Вижлян.
Как раз я хочу подхватить, да, тему
I would like
социологии,
to
которой сейчас занимаюсь.
pick up
Я
here on the topic of sociology.
главу
When
книги,
I read the introductory
вопрос.
chapter of the book,
Во-первых, мне казалось, что слово
I
архив,
had a question.
которое там
First,
употребляется,
the word
иногда
archive used
употребляется
it
в
there.
двух разных различительных значениях.
It is used in at least two different meanings.
Что-то мерцало тут.
And
Не
second,
очень понятно,
it
как
was
архив, иногда слово архив функционировало,
not fully
там были
understood.
какие-то такие места в тексте,
Like
да, и мне очень
archive
хотелось
was
какое-то
understood
провести
as canon.
разграничение между
What I wanted
тем, что есть
is
архив,
to
потому что делают
differentiate
примерно
between what
канонизация архивации, если
is
читать этот текст,
archive.
делают примерно одно и то же, да.
Normally they do the same.
Где проходит различение архива и
What
канона,
is
это отдельный
the
вопрос. Ну,
line
интерпретации.
between
Должно понятно,
archive
что
and
может быть
canon in your
множество разных, да,
interpretation, in
здесь
your
подходов
understanding? I
интерпретации.
understand there could
Вот.
be
И
many, but what
второе,
is your
мне
vision?
показалось, что вот эти значения
Second,
слова архив
it seemed to me that
можно,
two
наверное,
different
немножко вот так дифференцировать.
meaning of
Что не нужно
archive could be
заводить архивы, да, о чем,
differentiated.
значит, что тут цитировалось, да, над рукописями трястись. Архив
You
здесь
cited
имелся в
Pasternak,
виду вполне конкретное
don't
значение, то
archive.
есть архив как некоторый прямой путь
But also
для
archive as a
институциализации,
direct way
канонизации как
to make a
институциализации,
canon and
как
to
такой полной легитимации. То
institutionalize,
есть этот архив, да,
to
он
legitimize.
институционален, он придает тому, что сохраняется, смысл,
The archive brings
институциональный
the
смысл,
meaning,
да, вносит
the
некую структуру.
institution meaning
Это одно,
brings the
да.
structure
Другое,
to the
это
phenomena.
его
Next, Ernst with his portfolio. Before he could not even imagine in the wildest dreams. But at the same time, he would answer why he collects all these materials. But it was like on the level of intuition and feeling. And now we are dealing with the archive or cultural practice of it's different meaning. We have something included in the archive starts having a meaning of a community with a cult around it. To which extent you attributed meaning to this in the way I am describing how these two meanings engage, how they are envisaged in methodology and in the project.
Спасибо. Да.
Кошке тоже интересно услышать ответ.
Да, но боюсь, она не поймет его.
The cat is also interested in listening, hearing the answer.
Это, конечно, очень большой вопрос. Мы на самом деле погрузились в теорию.
I know we delved in the theory of archive, which started in the 1970s and 1990s with the fall of the Soviet bloc. The notion of archive, the positivist archive preservation, post-modern archives, Foucault, Derrida, which questioned the link and the science included in the archives. So this is my chaotic answer to this important question. We delved into the theory. And I think that the notion of an archive and counter-archive, I took it not an ideal structure, but as a working structure to understand how memory has been preserved, memory of this culture has been preserved. It was important for me to see how archive become the laboratory of the future canons. They could think about them, or they may not think about them. They would live in the present, but at the same time, there was a number of different points of view of what should be taken into the future. There was a certain hierarchy deflecting the official social Soviet culture. Recently, a colleague defended his thesis, his dissertation about Samizdat magazines, how they created their own policy of canonization. And he shed the light to many materials which show that a different view. I understand that I'm not answering fully to this question. Maybe I omitted something. I would pick up here. I would add to what Klava said, difference between canon and archive. I think that the difference between canon and archive it is different in terms of different communities. If we talk about imaginary community, for example, a nation, there is an imaginary archive, artists in the exhibition, or printed published literature. both attributed to the spirits of the nations, to the spirit of the nation. Next, other archives or living archives. In all these cases, archive and canon are very close to each other. In order to say what we regard as canon, we need archive for those communities which going to position themselves to the official discourse, official culture. Archives are necessary condition for creating, preserving canon. All discussions around it about Klava said all this are existing in the close space, how archive is linked to the critics of the canon and how it is seen from the perspective of a large imaginary community. Thank you very much. I would like to thank very much to the editors, for the participants of our seminar, and to our interpreters who had hard time today. We are going beyond our time, but maybe before we finish our seminar, I would like to ask the most important.
Если все, да, до следующего раза.
Yeah, you asked everything. I think this is enough questions. All the most important we've voiced already. Is there something very important that needs to be said today? I would like to thank very much from my side, Ilya. I would like to thank Klava for inviting me to the project, to organize conference, prepare the publication. It happened in the times of a hard period of life of my family. And I think that I will be still able to prepare an additional article on the topic. Our publication is just the start of work. It is a pity we did not have the possibility to talk about other culture than Russian language culture. But I would like to stress that this is the start of a big project, big work, to apply a counter-archive theory to Soviet unofficial culture, and also to other cultures of the way they developed after the crash of the Soviet regimes. I would like to add that there are extremely interesting and rich archives from in other centers, from Novosibirsk to Central Asian cities, Caucasus, and the scientists start writing about them. I do not know whether we'll have enough strength to put together the second book, and I hope we will. Thank you very much for the meeting. This gives a lot of strength and inspiration. I wish you a third and fourth book on this topic. I'm very glad we collected, brought together many participants, those who regularly come to our meetings and those who do not. Thank you. If you want to join our mailing list, please write to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye and see you next time.